It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George Live Line. This morning we're on Facebook, and that's so that all the political groups can hook up that are on Facebook that like to watch podcasts by George, and in particular, our guest. Yeah, he's coming back, folks. It's Dr. Politics, Steffen W. Schmidt. And by way of information and background, Dr. Schmidt earned a PhD in public law and government from Columbia University, New York. He's a founding and sustaining member of LULAC Council 307 in Iowa, one of the oldest Hispanic community and leadership organizations. We're going to talk about some Hispanic issues and whether or not they even ought to be referred to like that. That's coming up here shortly. He also served as the chair of the Iowa Governor's Spanish Speaking Commission. And that's something I know he's rightfully proud of. He was born and grew up in Colombia. Now, he's the author of 10 books, including 2 on identity theft. He's the co-author of American Government and Politics Today in its 19th edition. Let me hold that up. I didn't put it on my little stand. There it is, folks. That's the book. You got to get this. That's the American Government and Politics Today, 19th, and I think it's in its 20th edition by now. This book has been used in more college classrooms to teach political history, they think, than any other book, in American history. It's amazing. He's the author of many articles and columns on Latin America, U.S. issues, cyber threats, the politics of disruption, and women in politics, frequent political commentator of America and international media. And of course, in this neck of the woods, he's probably best known as the Lucan Endowed Professor Emeritus of Political Science in Iowa State University. So let me put that down. Let's bring him on in and say good morning to our good friend, our good buddy, our old pal, Dr. Politics. Welcome back to the PBG.
Thanks so much. You know, what you just did could be kind of put on my gravestone someday in tiny little letters.
It's funny that you would say that. I mentioned that on a podcast of mine just in the past month or so. People wonder why I like to read these long bios. Well, folks, that's all we are. And when it's all over with, that's all we were. I mean, and Doc, I tell people my biography is going to be something like he was the guy from Norwalk. I think that's probably how they're going to refer to me. Now, you're moving around. I know you get out and about. And I wanted to start the show here because you get an interesting perspective. We talk about Iowa all the time, but you're also heavily vested and involved in commentating and analyzing New Hampshire politics. And I'm always curious as to what they're talking about out there. I know you were just on New Hampshire radio. What were they talking about?
Not so different from what you talk about, what we talk about in Iowa. We talk about this virus that seems to be endless and constantly evolving. We're talking about elections and election fraud or no fraud, and how the political parties are going to be able to align themselves in 2022. There's a lot of interest in Donald Trump, the rise and fall of Donald Trump and the rise again of Donald Trump. So those are all things that, that resonate now across the country. Politics is very nationalized. I mean, school board meetings have become hotbeds of political controversy. Nobody used to go to a school board meeting except a few, people who are really interested and, the sort of community goodies. But now they've become this inflammatory environment of, with critical race theory, with LGBTQ becoming again a controversial subject. So politics in the United States is, I think, I'm in Florida right now. Believe me, Florida politics is hotter than heck. Governor DeSantis, is a national political figure. People are saying that he is basically the guy that Donald Trump has to worry about in 2024. So down here, where I am right now, a lot of talk about the governor of Florida running for president in 2024. So it's My concern is that politics, when it becomes an everyday, constant 24/7 engagement, and people are, really fired up about politics all the time, that's not good.
No,
That's
it's
not
not
good,
good.
because that's what happens in countries where there's constant turmoil. We used to have elections, and then we'd go home and we'd hope that these people that we elected would do good things. And if they didn't, we'd come back 2 years later, or 4 years later, or 6 years later for members of the Senate. And we either say, yeah, you're doing a pretty good job, we'll vote you back in, which is mostly what we did. Or we would say, oh, gosh, you really are an idiot, and I'm not going to vote for you again. So let's hope somebody else comes along. Now, every single day on every single issue, we are inflamed. And I worry about that, frankly.
Yeah, I do too. And we've talked about it a lot on my show. I say American politics is for everybody that doesn't like football, and particularly the older demographic. We've all gotten older. People have lost their interest in competing and in sports and that type of thing. And the new parlor game, and it's vicious, folks, is American politics. And they are playing it every day. Well, the doc actually has provided an excellent overview and an introduction to the first story that I wanted to cover here and get your perspective on, because you're uniquely qualified to comment on this, as I mentioned in my intro. And of course, this also is big news down in the state of Florida. So let's take a look at this. And this is very early polling, and I'm the first to admit this. I mean, these early polls can admit. But this talks about the upcoming election. 1,500 registered voters, 750 cell, 375 text to web people were interviewed for that. And I don't know exactly what that is, but the question is, how likely is it that you will vote in next November's election for Congress? Would you say you will definitely vote? 83%, probably vote 9%, 50-50 chance to vote, probably not vote, definitely not vote, and I don't know, refined. Okay, so here's what I would say about that right off the top, Doc. Now, remember, these are 1,500 registered voters. These are people that have registered to vote. And you look at these numbers and you think, well, 9% say they probably will, 4%, 50-50. And if you add these all up, it's about 15-20% of the electorate. But my sense always is those people that now say that they're probably going to vote, or they think that they will, when it comes time to actually get down there and do it and stand in lines and go through the bad weather and all that kind of stuff, it's at least this high of a percentage, and probably higher, that won't vote. And that's a big issue that you and I have talked about in the past.
Yeah, you're supposed to say, oh, yeah, I'm going to vote because that's civic duty and, the good thing. Actually getting yourself out there and being able to do it, or wanting to do it in the end, is a different thing. The Democrats have a bigger problem that's not in that statistic, which is there's some recent focus groups and polls. The Democratic voters are a huge percentage saying they won't vote in 2022. And the Democrats are very worried about it.
Oh, boy, and they ought to be. Well, let's continue here. I want to spin through this. Next question. Yeah. Would you say that things in the country are going in the right direction or headed in the wrong direction? My God, look at this, Doc. Right direction, 27%. Wrong direction. This is across all political parties, 63%. And don't know or refuse to answer. And again, I don't know what that means. That's about 10%. Again, that does not portend well for the party in power. And you got to remember, it's a goofy, weak supermajority, but the Democrats have got it technically right now. They're in control of the American government. And look at that statistic.
Well, the American public is worried about the coronavirus, the fact that it just won't go away, that we're having lockdowns again, that we're having talk about kids going back to learning on Zoom and distance learning, the fact that inflation is high, and the economy is a big worry for a lot of people. Prices are going up, and there are shortages. I went to a grocery store the other day, and I was surprised. There were a lot of things that just weren't on the shelf because they can't get them, or they can't get them in a timely manner. And for the party in power, especially in an off-year election, the party of the president is always at a disadvantage. In the past, historically, the party of the president in the off year, when there is no presidential election, doesn't do very well. The Democrats didn't do very well in the last election and barely got a majority in the House and Senate. When we think, in 2020, oh yeah, the Democrats won. Well, Biden became president, but the Democrats barely hung on and lost a lot of seats in the House. So they didn't do well even then. This is a real problem for Democrats.
I know it, and I'm out on the ledge, and you have to, I got to tell folks now, Doc's a frequent guest on the show, but he and I are friends, and he kids me all the time because I'm a doom and gloomer. I mean, but I'm out on the ledge looking at these stats and these early polls. They are not good. There is no way to look upon these except the fact that it's early to construe this in favor of the Democrats or the progressive or the left values that I hold near and dear. Now, I agree with everything the Doc just said. I also look at this and say that the Democrats are being hurt by the fact that they're caving in on all these initiatives that are so popular with Americans that help get them elected. They're not able either, by accident or design to follow through on these initiatives. They're getting overruled by parliamentarians and Joe Manchin and all of these initiatives, these things that would help people, that would improve their standing in these polls, I think, are simply not happening. Let's look at this next one now. And this is exactly what you're talking about. And the Doc knows this better than anybody. I mean, it's this kitchen table issue thing that he talks about all the time. I mean, the economy is what turns elections. This is what people vote. You hear that vote their pocketbook thing. Well, specifically, would you say that the economy is going in the right direction or headed in the wrong direction? Right direction, 30%. Wrong direction, 61%. Holy buckets. Don't know or refuse to answer. Again, that's about that 9% of the electorate. How would you rate the strength of the U.S. economy? Excellent. These would be diehard Democratic Biden supporters. I would think 6%. Good, 33%. Total positive, 39%. That's the strength of the overall economy. Positive, 39%. Not so good, 33%. Poor, 26%. Total, negative, 59%. And we're going to talk about a lot of stats in this early polling that I think are significant, Doc. But I mean, that economy thing, I'm sure you'll agree, has to be at top of the list.
It is. And people are going to look at that table you showed, and they're going to say, especially on this particular wonderful podcast of yours, well, it's the Wall Street Journal, and they probably are really picking and choosing the respondents so that they end up with really negative numbers. But those numbers reflect a lot of other polls that are not Wall Street Journal polls. It's pretty consistent in terms of people thinking the country is going in the wrong direction. And it's hard looking out at what's going on every day in this country, not to be kind of negative. There's not a lot of happy news. And President Biden tries to put a smiley face on it and put a little lipstick on the pig, and people are still seeing the pig. So you've got, this morning I saw a number on the military, for example, a huge percentage, too many, are refusing to get vaccines, even though vaccines have been mandated for people in the service, and the service says. And that's concerning. That's very concerning. I mean, when you're in the military, you're given an order, and the correct answer is always yes, sir, or yes, ma'am. These people are saying, no, sir, no, ma'am, I'm not getting a vaccine, even though it has been ordered by the commander in chief and by my commanding officer here in this particular unit. Well, I've heard that before. I grew up in Latin America. The military in Latin America very often does not obey the commander in chief, and sometimes they even get involved in politics directly. And in the case of Venezuela, they overthrow the government. Hugo Chavez was a military officer who did not like the government that he was serving under in the military, and he overthrew the government. People will say, "Oh, Stefan, come on, this is the United States. We don't do that kind of thing."
Yeah, January
No,
6th. Yeah.
yeah,
God. I used to
yeah,
think that too, Doc, till I turned on the
yeah.
television on January 6th. I don't think that anymore.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, we have to understand that the past is not always an indicator of the future. You know,
Yeah.
people think, well, history repeats itself. Well, sometimes it doesn't repeat itself,
Well,
and we're in a very difficult position right now.
let's keep running here. I want to get through these. We got a lot of things to talk to the doc. Is for one thing, he hasn't been on for you haven't been on for 2 or 3 weeks, so we got a lot of things to
Yeah,
talk about. It
yeah.
says all other things being equal, if the election for Congress. Now, this is what we're talking about here in 2022, folks. If it were held today, would you be more likely to vote for Republican candidates or the Democratic candidate for Congress? Definitely Republican, 34%. Probably Republican, 10%. Total Republican, 44%. And then here you go with the Democratic numbers. Probably Democrat, 9%. Definitely Democrat, 32%. Total Democrat, 41%. And then these unsure, depends, undecided, and refused candidates that are in there. And again, I would look at that statistic and say, okay, Democrats, you're in charge. I mean, you got control of both of these houses, although that's subject to debate also. Now's the time to do something to bring these people on board. All right, question 16 in the survey. Now, I'm just spinning through some of these. Regardless of how you may feel personally about each man, would you rather continue pursuing Joe Biden's policies and proposals or return to Donald Trump's policies and proposals? And I was very interested in this, Doc, because if I'm in the ecosphere like a lot of people are, and if you're in the world of MSNBC, for instance, you're not going to see polling results like this, because this will give you a heart attack if you're an MSNBC viewer. I mean, it's hard to believe, actually. You wouldn't even think that this was possible, but it's true, at least in this early polling that the Wall Street Journal and these other research firms put together. Strongly continue Biden's policies and proposals, 35%. Somewhat continue Biden's policies and proposals, 11%. So there's 46% combined. And then look down here, total return to Trump's policies and proposals. Now, think what you may of Donald Trump, and I don't think much of him, and a lot of people don't, Doc, but I think less of his programs and policies than I do of him, even though that's hard to believe. And here we are looking at this poll. What do you make of that?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, you could also have asked, Democratic policies and proposals or the Republican policies and proposals. Donald Trump's policies were not all that different from the Republican Party's platform and position on abortion and all kinds of other issues, big government, taxes, over-regulation of business, and all those things. What was different was the way that Donald Trump pursued those and projected them. It was his personality, and it still is, that was so interesting and controversial. Many of the policies were really not so much. I mean, putting the American embassy in Jerusalem instead of Tel Aviv. Republicans have been arguing that should be done. Even some Democrats had been arguing that. So when I look at that poll, I think if they hadn't put in the policies of Donald Trump and put in instead the policies of the Republican Party, it would be less controversial, let's put it that way, because the country is divided. The country is half Republican, half Democrat, and another third, I guess that's more than 100%, progressive, Bernie Sanders, and other progressives who have a difficult time gaining a foothold in this country. But we are a country that is split down the middle. And I've got polling numbers and little pie charts that are gorgeous that show consistently over the years, over many, many years. I've been teaching for 50 years. The party, it's Democrat or Republican, and sometimes one party gains a little bit over the other, but we're very deeply divided. And I think that's what those numbers show. The other thing in that poll, and there are polls like this, would you vote for Donald Trump? Would you vote for Ron DeSantis? Would you vote for, put in a bunch of other Republican names? And I have a feeling you'd be interested to see that a lot of people actually would say, well, I like DeSantis quite a bit because of this or that. Or, Governor Christie is back out there now. I think Christie is going to try to run for president, and that's not 2022, that's 2024. But when you have an alternative, sometimes the numbers look different than if you just give people one choice. If you tell people, would you vote for Trump or Biden? They'll, half the country will say Trump. If you say, would you vote for DeSantis, Biden, Trump, whatever, might get a more divided response.
Well, let's turn back to our friends at the Wall Street Journal here, because this is a category that the doc is extremely well qualified, uniquely qualified, really, with his experience in American politics and his background, even where he was born, to be able to comment on this. And he's down in Florida right now. So let's bring this up because this is really interesting, folks. Yeah. The Hispanic voters now evenly split between parties, the Wall Street Journal finds. And Doc, you'd be the first to comment on this, I suppose, and you know the history better than anybody. 20 years ago, you wouldn't have believed a headline like that, I don't think.
And Democrats didn't believe it, and many still don't believe it. In fact, when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were running against each other, for that election, I came to Miami 3 times and I briefed all 3 of the major Spanish language networks, Univision, Telemundo, and CNN en Español. I briefed their reporters and their anchors and others. And one of the things I said was, watch out, because Donald Trump is going to get a certain percentage of the Latino or Hispanic vote. And there are various reasons for it. And they laughed at me. On all 3 networks, they said, oh, no, Donald Trump, he's against immigration and, Hispanics are never going to vote for him. And after the election, I tried not to say I told you so, but more even after Donald Trump got elected, and now his numbers have strengthened, and by virtue of that, the numbers for the Republican Party have strengthened. And one reason that I gave at that time was American Hispanics really don't like a lot of illegal immigration because it floods the market with people who are willing to work for below minimum wage, undocumented, and it drives down wages. And that's not something people like, whether you're Hispanic or not. And the other thing is that Hispanic voters tend to be somewhat more conservative. They often are Catholic, and so they often are opposed to abortion. They often are uncomfortable with gay rights and LGBTQ. And I said, that is likely, they're not going to say it, but they're likely to vote for the Republicans who fit their particular views on things a little bit more, for a lot of them anyway.
Well, and the third rail that even I have to be careful about talking about on podcast by George, Doc, is that correct me if I'm wrong now, because but I also think that these voters that you're talking about, the men in particular, are a little bit more on the machismo side of things, and they like this strong leadership element. And I think Trump appealed to them because they kind of like this, tough talking, plain spoken. Sometimes we think he was just stupid and ignorant, but I think that they like that strong leader of the family, of the government, and they vote for that.
No question that machismo is there, and it's not just among Hispanics. I mean, American, men often also like strong leaders. A lot of American women like strong leaders. So in the contrast between Biden, Biden, one of the problems Biden has is he's not viewed as a strong leader who can push back, who can go out there and punch people, who is going to go into a rally and have hecklers basically evicted and tell people, if you hurt that person and beat them up on the way out, I'll pay for the lawyers. Don't worry about it. You can go ahead and beat them up. There are people who like that strong leadership, and Biden seems, frankly, a lot of people that I speak to or speak with and communicate with are saying, Biden seems sort of old and weak and a little bit out of touch, and that hurts the Democrats as a whole. I think it hurts the party as a whole. And of course, Biden is doing the best he can with an avalanche of terrible things that have been poured into our political system and our economy. But yes, you're right. We haven't wanted to talk about machismo very much, but it certainly, was there, and probably the admiration for a successful businessman, for example, is also a factor with Donald Trump, regardless of what you think of his business skills.
Yeah, that's kind of like a corporatist machismo. I mean, again, somebody that can beat the game, beat the system, beat the government, beat the tax man. That appeals to
it does.
A lot of people. Yeah.
And remember this. In the Iowa State Fair before the election, a gigantic airplane flew over the fairgrounds in Des Moines that said Trump on it, because he had a huge airplane that was his own personal airplane that he flew around with. And then, we've said this before, he also brought a helicopter that was a Trump helicopter, and it flew in there and landed and gave kids rides. Well, that gave a sense of, wow, this guy is rich and powerful, and look at this. The Democrats didn't have anything like that.
Let me bring this up on screen. I've had this up a couple of times, and I'll spin through this very quickly and maybe get your comment at the end. And it just reinforces what you've been saying. The nation's large and diverse group of Hispanic voters is showing signs of dividing its support between Democrats and Republicans more evenly than in recent elections. A new Wall Street Journal poll finds a troubling development for the Democratic Party, which has long counted on outsized Hispanic support. 1 year after giving Democratic House candidates more than 60% of their votes, according to polls at the time, the Journal survey found that Hispanic voters are evenly split now in their choice for Congress. Asked which party they would back if the election were today, 37% of Hispanic voters said they would support the Republican congressional candidate, and 37% said they would favor the Democrat, with 22% undecided. And folks, as narrowly split as this electorate is right now, this is a difference maker. This is huge stuff. Hispanic voters were also evenly divided when asked about a hypothetical rematch in 2024 of the last presidential contenders, with 44% saying they would back President Biden and 43% supporting former President Donald Trump. In 2020, that wasn't that long ago, folks, Mr. Biden won 63% support among Hispanic voters, nearly 30 points more than Mr. Trump, according to AP VoteCast, a large survey of the presidential electorate. Hispanic voters account for about 1 in 8 eligible voters and are one of the fastest growing groups in the electorate, factors that compound Democratic fears about any deterioration in support. Quote, Latinos are more and more becoming swing voters. They're a swing vote, so that we're going to have to fight for it, said Democratic pollster John Anzalone, whose company conducted the Wall Street Journal poll. Okay, Doc, I guess maybe that this goes on a little bit, but that's probably enough of that.
Yeah.
Here's a graph for people that are like me, that are, too dumb to read and understand, and they want to look at things visually. And this also shows the split not only of the Hispanic voters, but between men and women. And then looking at Biden and Trump, look at those charts, folks. And then, do you approve or disapprove of the job Joe Biden is doing as president? I don't know, Doc, and you mentioned this, so I guess I would look at these Hispanic voters and say, the economy that we talked about, it always most dramatically affects people at the lower end of the income spectrum, which particularly newly arriving immigrants, they're starting at the bottom, and they're really impacted by things like this inflation that's affecting us right now. And then, of course, that immigration issue, but it has Florida inflamed where you're at, also Texas, large population centers for Hispanic voters.
No, and we have to remember, in the United States, you win state by state and get electoral votes. So it's where the Hispanic vote is large and can be a swing vote. And more states have large numbers of Hispanics who are American citizens. Remember this. no voting if you're not a U.S. citizen. All right. If you're a recent immigrant, you can't vote unless you're a citizen, which you have to become. And so it's American citizens who are of Hispanic ancestry who are becoming a more competitive group. And I'm not sure the Democrats are doing a great job in appealing to them. And there are also these other issues that we've talked about, and the people viewing this, and you know that a lot of the sort of what we call the woke political issues like Latinx, which is something here in academia that has become very, very popular. Latinx instead of Latino or Latina, which are gender specific, are not very popular with the Latina, Latino, Hispanic community.
Well, I've got an article on exactly that.
You do? Okay.
Yeah, the doc's done a great segue here for us, because again, this is something that he knows. I mean, this guy is an authority on American politics, 50 years in the university classroom teaching this. But again, this is right in his wheelhouse. This is from NBC News. A new poll of Hispanic voters finds the term Latinx or Latinx, I don't know what you want to call it, does not resonate among them. And 40% say the use of the word bothers or offends them. The poll was conducted in mid-November by Ben Dixon and Mondi International, a Democratic firm focusing on Latino outreach. It found that 30% of Hispanic voters, 24% of Democrats, 43% of Republicans are less likely to support a politician or political organization using that word. Quote, the numbers strongly suggest that the use of this term may actually be counterproductive as opposed to productive, because only 2% of Hispanic voters nationally embraced the term, said Fernanda Mondi, the firm's principal, who's worked on a number of national and presidential campaigns. The term Latinx was created as a gender-neutral alternative to Latino or Latina. It has gained some traction during the past several years among politicians. I mean, next to used car salesmen and advertising salesmen, which I used to be, probably the most despised demographic in America, the politicians are embracing this. Academics, some academics, I don't think the doc is, and corporations, and is more common among younger and progressive Latinos, but it's not used widely in the community, according to Pew Research. Doc, I've been wanting to ask you about that. Where the hell did that come from, and what's the future of it?
Well, you know, I understand that the community of LGBTQ, queer, gay community does not like binary divisions of male, female. You know, there's a whole thing about transgender and how gender is fluid and how people often define themselves in terms of whether they have a gender or not. And that's why people are now putting their pronouns on a lot of things that they send around, because they want to kind of tell people, well, I want to be called they, or I want to be called him. And I understand that, and that's perfectly legitimate. But it should we have to be very careful when we politicize those things, because then they become actually a tool for political conflict and disagreement. And a lot of Hispanics, I use the term Hispanics because I can stay away from Latino and Latina, you know, are not very comfortable with that. Well, I've said that it's the same thing that Black and progressives who supported Black Lives Matter got themselves into a real bind with defund the police. You know, the phrase defund the police was meant to say, you know, we need to basically improve policing. We need to make sure that policing is more fair, that there isn't a lot of unnecessary and illegal criminal violence when policing takes place. But the name defund the police was like throwing a match, you know, into the gasoline pool. And it has also driven away a lot of Americans who really need the police, who find the police to be necessary because they want the security of policing. And the Latinx to some extent at least, is also has become a hot political term, which I don't think it was intended to. But academics and academia very often wanders into things without understanding that it could have backfire and have let's say, a consequence that is actually the opposite of what they were hoping for.
Well, to expand upon that, the way that I look at it is, um, the usage of this, the upshot of it came directly from the politicians, from these folks that we're talking about, from some academics, from some talking heads on media. Defund the police the same way, but particularly this. And I've always been of the mind, going way back to our day, Doc, that whatever you want to call yourself, that's okay with me because it's yourself. I remember all too well Muhammad Ali wanting to be called Muhammad Ali instead of Cassius Clay, and a lot of people objected to that. And I remember at the time as a kid even thinking, well, wait a minute, I know what John Wayne's real name is. It's Marion Morrison. And
Right.
John Wayne doesn't want to call himself Marion Morrison, but he does, and everybody's okay with that. So if Muhammad Ali wants to call himself that instead of Cassius Clay, I'm okay with that. And same way with this Latinx or Latinx.
Right.
If this had come from the community and this is what they wanted to be called, I'm cool with that. I mean, that's great, but that doesn't look to me like that's what this is.
Well, and I agree completely with you. And I think that, people who don't want to be gender, specific have the right to say, well, I'm not sure, I don't want to be a male or a female. I move back and forth or, but the problem is, as always, and I try telling some of my students that, but they don't listen to me. So, that's water under the bridge or over the dam. When they went and started protesting at the State House in Des Moines and yelling insults and using the F word against legislators and the police, jumping up and down on police cars and crushing them and yelling, defund the police. I did have a conversation with some of my students, and I said, it's great that you're expressing yourself, and we have a First Amendment, and we have the right to protest, and those things sometimes are necessary and important, but sometimes they backfire. And my goodness, in Iowa, I know I'm moving away from the Latinx thing for a second here, but what happened in Des Moines after those protests was that the legislature, the city council in the city of Des Moines, actually greatly increased the amount of spending for the police and did not defund the police because they were offended by it and angry about how they were attacked. And so sometimes how you do things, can backfire. And I think that's something that politically, you never know how it's going to come out. I mean, Martin Luther King didn't back down, and there was a lot of great progress made in civil rights because people protested and pointed out the horrible inequities. And it may be that this will all blow over at some point and nobody will care. But for the moment, it's like critical race theory. Why do you have to call it critical race theory, which sounds really like some paper given at a academic meeting somewhere in Atlanta or whatever? Why not just call it teaching history? Once you put in critical race theory and you refer to the New York Times article about how America was really founded when the first slaves were unloaded from a boat, that may be interesting for academics, and I certainly read that information, and it's fascinating, but it can be used politically to set on fire those school board meetings, that we're talking about. School board meetings with, all of these terms being thrown in, and the claim that you're indoctrinating people and that you're blaming, current students, especially white students in classes for slavery. That's never going to fly very well. And it has now become as you know, and I know, that the Republican leadership has funded training programs to train people who will run for school board in a lot of places around the country. I think 2,000 people or so have been in these training programs on how to go in there and run for school board and object to these things. So, once things become really hotly politicized, it creates tension and disruption, and that's where we are in December of 2021. We're in a moment, where politics has descended from national all the way down. Who would have ever guessed, to school board meetings and county commissioner elections.
And the doc and I are agreeing on this. We're not disagreeing. Like critical race theory, man, I want it to be taught. I want the truth to be taught. That's the truth, folks. But the problem is with the labeling, like the doc is talking about, that can destroy everything. I'm not big on labeling. I'm big on the truth and open and full disclosure. And of course he is too, as an academic. And, it's a very interesting subject. We'll have to circle back to it. I had something else I wanted to say, but I've kind of forgotten. Okay, let's go to the next piece here, because Doc has mentioned he's in Florida. He's this authority in New Hampshire, also in Iowa. We haven't had him on for a while, so let's talk about Iowa. This is something that was in the Iowa poll, and Doc, this really kind of stuck in my craw a little bit. I got to bring this up. Here's a majority of likely voters. This is from the Iowa poll in the Des Moines Register, preferring Chuck Grassley to Abby Finkenauer in Iowa's election for the U.S. Senate. I look at that and think, my God, that's biased. I mean, out of the Democratic candidates that are going to primary, that are going to try to get this nomination, they pick her. But I suppose she is the leader with a little bit of name recognition, although the Register seemed to jump all over that very quickly. I'm wanting to get Chuck Grassley out of there in the worst way, because I'm on the left, and look at this, 37% for Abby Finkenauer, 55% for Chuck Grassley, 89 years old at this point, voted for the Iraq War, voted for these big ag corporations that are poisoning our water. My God, votes against Medicare for all. Well, everything that's on my show, basically, the big three on Podcast by George, it's climate, war, and healthcare. Grassley is the epitome of these old politicians in D.C. that have gotten us where we are today. And this is what the Democrats are able to come up with. Doc, I look at this and say, it's going to happen again. He's going to steamroll to re-election here, and the Democrats are stuck on bringing in Abby Finkenauer to run against him. She's got no shot, no chance. And I got a guy that I really like, Dr. Glenn Hurst. It's been on my podcast out there on the progressive left. I would try him. I would put some money behind him. I would put support behind somebody different, somebody that's going to give people something, try to energize the part of the electorate that does not vote in Iowa, probably in off-year election here in 2022. That's going to be a third maybe of the voters. I don't know exactly what that percentage will be, but try to get them to come in and vote Democratic. Abby Finkenauer is not going to do it. And I don't know. I'm out on the ledge on this one, Doc.
Well, I'm politically neutral. I don't choose sides. Yeah. I'm an independent. I'm not a progressive. I'm not a conservative. I try to just stay up there and look down and say, what's going on down here? And the Democrats really feel they need to have either a woman or a minority running or chairing the Democratic Party in the state, regardless of where they are, because that's sort of the Democratic gesture to inclusion. And the Democrats are very big on that. And so I think Abby Finkenauer lost re-election for a congressional seat here.
Yeah, she did. One term.
I think the first district, maybe.
Yep.
And so, when you lose an election that, to me is kind of a little bit risky. I think there are also some other candidates running or at least wanting to win the primary for governor and other things who I'm not sure, I don't know, may or may not be the best candidates to run. But, Chuck Grassley, is the example of incumbency. And you folks know incumbents almost always win. I mean, Abby Finkenauer is the exception. She was the incumbent and didn't win. But incumbency is very strong. And Chuck Grassley is a known quality. He goes to every single one of the 99 counties every year and, goes to the Dairy Queen. If the Dairy Queen in Nevada went away a long time ago, so he can't go to the Dairy Queen there. But, he's folksy.
He visits all 99 Iowa counties. Yeah, he travels to all 99 counties. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. Yeah,
and he knows everybody. He knows all these people. He has a huge sort of network of friends and supporters. And that's just in most parts of the country. We don't have a lot of term limits in this country, and so once you get elected, unless you are really bad in some way or another. Even when you're really bad, sometimes you get reelected. So it's not a big surprise. It's a surprise to me that Grassley at his age still wants to continue in this mud wrestling or dumpster fire that's Congress. I mean, you'd think maybe he'd want to spend a little more time with his grandkids and go back to his farm and grow some beans and corn and but he loves politics. I know him. He's come and lectured to my classes, and of course that's just the way it goes.
Doc, he gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning and jogs. Did you know that? Yeah, I mean, people are going to vote for that. I mean, they're going to vote for. They're going to go to the box and vote for that guy because he's 89 years old, but he jogs. He visits all Iowa 99 counties. He goes to the Dairy Queen, like you're talking about, and people get on me. They say, "Okay, George, how come you're so smart? How can you criticize somebody like Chuck Grassley?" Well, okay, I was on a street corner with a sign protesting the Iraq War. My wife led demonstrations against that Iraq War. Chuck Grassley voted for it. Who was right in that scenario? Well, dumb old George and his wife was. You look at this. You look at the water situation in Iowa. My wife again has led demonstrations for that years ago. She was right. Look at the crisis that we're in with our water here. Chuck Grassley is largely responsible for the votes in Congress that resulted in that. This Medicare for All issue that he is adamantly opposed to, that he votes against all the time. You've seen that survey that comes out where 200,000 Americans, maybe out of the 800,000 that are dead and in the ground because of COVID-19, could have been saved if we'd have had a Medicare for All. 200,000 people that are having a real bad day because they're dead. That's why I want people like Chuck Grassley, and he isn't the only one, believe me, out of Congress, get a change, get something new, and the Democrats run Abby Finkenauer. That's who they're behind. That's who they're going to put up to get this change that we need to survive. That's the way that I feel.
Well, we don't know. We haven't had a primary yet, and we don't know which Democrat is going to come out on top and run against Senator Grassley. But I would say no matter which one it is, it's going to be an uphill race. It's going to be an uphill battle.
God, look at that chart.
You got the connections and you got the stream of revenue that comes into incumbents. So, that's just the way it goes.
And of course, on this chart, one of the biggest things that I will point towards always, this 37%, when you look at this pie chart, this is the percentage of people that are planning not to vote in this election because they believe it's a foregone conclusion, perhaps, and perhaps it is. But my belief is give those people something. All these pollsters, all these research analysts, find out who that 37% is. And if they're young people that like to smoke marijuana and don't want to go to jail for it and maybe already have, come out as a candidate and say, I'm going to give you free marijuana, because that isn't going to harm us as much as what's been harming us, which is war, climate, and healthcare. Okay, we're going to lose the doc here, and he doesn't want to listen to me rant anyway. So I'm going to, I want to go to this next slide, Doc, and you can comment on this or not, because I was struck by the fact that this really made it. I saw you online, maybe on Facebook or Twitter or someplace like that, commenting on this. This is from our buddy Matthew Ho. Now, I know the doc has seen him on my podcast before also. Mm-hmm. He says, in case anyone is still unsure, this is why they hate us, Matthew Ho says. And for the historically ignorant, such widespread killing by the U.S. and its allies goes back decades in the Muslim world. And of course, this is this big story that came out in the New York Times in just the past couple of weeks. Civilian deaths mounted as secret unit pounded ISIS. An American strike cell alarmed its partners as it raced to defeat the enemy. And I tell you, Doc, nobody knew about this. That's kind of the reason for the story. And I think you were kind of shocked to see this as well.
You know, the civilian casualties have always been part of war. I mean, think about World War II, think about Nagasaki, Hiroshima, think about my relatives long ago in Germany, Dresden, my relatives in Hamburg, Germany, who had to run to a gigantic concrete bunker whenever the Allied forces flew, and it was mostly the British in Hamburg, and dropped bombs in the cities. And so civilian casualties and war kind of go together. But in the modern world, we don't have declared wars where there's a consensus that something, had to be done. We voted for it. Congress voted for it. We go in and the civilian casualties are what we call collateral damage, which is a terrible term. It's human beings being killed. But in the 21st century now, it's asymmetrical. When you kill civilians, it's not just, well, okay, if we defeat the enemy, that'll be forgotten, because it is guerrilla warfare. It is ISIS, is the Taliban, it is the Viet Cong. I mean, in Vietnam, we killed a lot of civilians with our bombing, with Agent Orange dropped over the jungles that, poisoned people and created horrible deformed children by birth defects. But we won the war. We didn't win the war, did we? We lost the war in Vietnam.
Yeah.
We are losing the war in Iraq. We're losing the war. We've lost the war in Afghanistan. Yeah. And when you kill civilians, they remember. They remember, and they're not going to necessarily be your friends. Vietnam is a strange exception because we have now good relations with Vietnam. We're moving, a lot of American companies are moving from China to Vietnam to manufacture because China is becoming kind of a wonky ally in trade and other ways. But, people don't forget when their family members are killed. We had the same situation occur at the very end of the pullout there in Kabul when we bombed the family. We thought it was, an ISIS attack that was planned, a bombing attack against the airport. So it's, war is hell. I made up that phrase a long time ago.
I ain't no doubt about it, Doc. You're exactly right. I mean, that is the reality. Most of and Matthew Ho will be the first one to attest to this, most of the casualties are civilians and friendly fire, accidental deaths. I mean, it has always been that way, basically. Yeah. Well, we're out of time here. I want to wrap this up, and I want to maybe end on a little bit more of a lighthearted note. I got this off of Twitter. This is a guy that I really like, Jim Earl. And Doc has talked about this type of thing on the show before. This is from CBSNews.com. Spain orders 30,000 people to seal themselves indoors as volcano, whatever that volcano was. Spanish authorities order about 30,000 people on La Palma Island to lock down as the volcano erupting for months springs violently back to life. And Jim Earl says this lockdown is clearly a ploy to crush the most vulnerable, transfer wealth into the hands of big tech oligarchs, and obliterate our human rights to inhale volcanic gas. And of course, he's taking a kind of a jab at leftist progressives like me, but also these people that refuse to get vaccinated in the COVID situation as well.
Sometimes governments tell you to do something that actually is probably a pretty good idea. Yeah, I don't want to inhale any volcanic gas, believe me.
Yeah, that's great. All right, Doc, we're going to wrap it up. We're going to leave it here. We're about, I don't know if we're an hour into this yet, but we're getting close. Now, one other thing here, maybe you can wrap up with this. I know that you're not in the classroom, obviously. You're down in Miami, but now we're getting ready to heat up into another election cycle. And, is Doc Politics going to stay on the case here? Are you going to continue to work this?
Yeah, I'm in Key West, actually. Nobody wants to be in Miami. Good Lord, the traffic is horrible, and we watch the news every night, and there are more gunfights in Miami than in Dodge City. But yes, I follow politics. I comment on it. I have a lot of media that I do in Germany and in Latin America. I'm pretty busy all the time, and for that reason, because I follow politics, I'm pretty depressed most of the time.
Yeah, me too. My God, yeah.
There's not much happiness going on in politics, believe me. Plus, the economy of the world is suffering, and some countries are collapsing. Lebanon is apparently about to collapse as a country, completely collapse, because their currency is now worth nothing. They have no reserves. They have no products, and so probably mass starvation will begin. And I think Turkey and other countries are not doing so well either in terms of how they're managing themselves. Venezuela is still a basket case. Nobody does anything about it. We're too busy with all kinds of other things. So my career used to be a lot, I think, less stressful than it is now. I think things have really become so difficult.
That's because
I'm interested in it, but it's tough.
Yeah, tell me about it. I put on Twitter the other day, it's human nature to believe that things are going to get better, but what we're experiencing right now is it ain't human nature, it's unnatural. I mean, this is yeah, it's not human nature,
Well,
it's unnatural. Yeah.
If you look at history, I just read a fantastic National Geographic special issue on the Roman Empire and gladiators. If you think things were better back then, just get that issue. It should be available in almost any grocery store or wherever. It's just incredibly fascinating, the brutality of the Romans in conquering most of the known world by sheer violence, brutality, fear, and the gladiators were kind of like cage fighters. They were actually entertainment. It's just fascinating. So things have been a lot worse in some cases. And if you look at World War II and what was going on then, certainly World War I was absolutely horrible. So maybe things are not as bad as we think.
Well, let's hope not. Although the Roman Empire, folks, that's how my leftist friends refer to the United States. We're an empire. We have 1,000 military bases ringing the globe. We've expanded worldwide with our military. And of course, what really happened to the Roman Empire, Doc's reading that book, my understanding is it was this expansion, this empire building from without, and they collapsed from within. And to me, that is strikingly similar to the situation that we're experiencing right here in the United States. We got to leave it there. We got to get out of here. Doc, as always, pal, I mean, we'll get you back here sooner, because if we don't, we have all these things to talk about and we end up going on for over an hour. But folks,
I'm always stimulated when you have your podcast and invite me. So I'm going to go and find myself a margarita somewhere here.
Yeah, that's a good thing to do, folks. That's
margarita, the drink, by the way.
Yeah. Dr. Steffen W. Schmidt, Dr. Politics, as he's known worldwide. He's the professor emeritus of political science from Iowa State University. He's a friend of Podcast by George, and we're just delighted to have him on. We'll talk to you soon, Doc.
Thank you.
And folks, if you like Podcast by George, and if you like these visits with the doc that I'm just so delighted to do, please go to podcastbygeorge.com. It's easy to do, and you can select whatever type of show you want to get. You can get just the audio only on Spotify and iTunes. You can get the videos on Twitter, and you can get them on, of course, YouTube and Facebook, wherever podcasts are seen or heard. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast